Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Lion, the Way, and the War, where we talk about Jesus, his church, and the spiritual battle that surrounds us all. My name is Craig Allison, and I'll be your host. All right, so I'm so excited today to have Dr. Doug Burleson visiting us today from Henderson, Tennessee. Hendersonville? Henderson, Tennessee. Up in where Freed-Hardeman University is.
Yes.
No longer college. It used to be Freed-Hardeman College. It's university.
That's right. FHU instead of FHC.
Since 2010, Dr. Doug Burleson has served as a professor in Bible at Freed-Hardeman University, where he is also the assistant dean of the College of Biblical Studies and the director of the annual Bible lectureship. That's a big lectureship, too, for those that don't know. He is married to Christy Johnson Burleson, and they have 4 children. Doug is a graduate of Freed-Hardeman and has his master's degree from Freed-Hardeman. Lipscomb also has a master's degree from Lipscomb.
That's right.
And New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Doug also has a PhD in New Testament and Greek from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He is a member of the board of directors for Lads to Leaders. So if you're a Church of Christ, you definitely know what that is. And began serving as one of the preachers at the Estes Church of Christ in Henderson, Tennessee in August of 2016. And he enjoys traveling with his family, enjoys tent camping. Thus far, you've tent camped in Arkansas, California, Kansas, Maine, Minnesota, Tennessee, and Wyoming. Any others to add to that since this was put out?
I'm working on adding another state or two, but there's lots of stories there, including some wild animals. But, hey, we've lived. That's the main thing.
So not RV camping, but tent camping.
No glamping. Okay. 8-man tent.
The real deal.
I mean, roughing it with, a propane tank. But it's...
How does your wife enjoy? Is she on board with this?
She loves it. She's even tent camped with us while pregnant.
Okay.
And so I've always thought I have no reason to complain. If she can do it, I can do it.
What's the age of your kids?
17, 14, 11, and 7.
Okay, so that's a wide range of kids, and you've been married for, I'm going to say, 24 years.
You are spot on. May of next year, it'll be 25.
I what's it called? Facebook stalked you. So
I was going to say, wow, you have a gift.
Yeah.
Where's the carnival?
So you've been busy. Let's see. Clearly, you don't like education. I mean, that's obvious, right?
Well, I've always been a fan of what Paul says in Ephesians 4 of equipping the saints for the building up. And so I just wanted to go to school as long as possible. Not that I think that's the only way to learn, but doors of opportunity continued opening. And I thought I want to be useful. I want to be a resource. And so I went to school until I was 32. And I'm thankful that those days are behind me, but I'm still learning every day, growing.
Yeah.
So I love it.
Well, okay, so Bible professor, full-time preacher, right. Husband, father of 4 kids that are all in very different stages of life right now.
Right.
Do you have what's it called? The celebrities have the person that manages their schedule, and do you have one of those, or what's going on in your life, Doug?
Well, first of all, I love Google Calendar. It's a blessing to me. It keeps me on point. But first of all, Christy is amazing, and she is a partner and friend, and is so patient. I mean, I got in yesterday from a meeting in Little Rock and had enough time to wash clothes and kind of catch up and get the yard mowed and talk about Vacation Bible School next week, and then she helped me get out the door. And so in addition to that, I actually have a co-preacher at Estes who is also on the Bible faculty at Freed-Hardeman. And so we share preaching responsibilities, and that allows us each to have a little bit more time away, which is nice. I was in Turkey earlier this year visiting the 7 churches of Asia.
Oh, wow.
Went to the Isle of Patmos. I was gone for about 10 days, and it was okay.
Any revelations on Patmos?
Well... We saw the cave. We couldn't take pictures, okay. Where they believe, including the holy, you heard of the holy hand grenade. Well, there was the holy, place where he put his hand while he was writing, apparently. They've kind of got a church building in that spot now. But Patmos was amazing. It was a 10-hour boat ride from Turkey and back round trip. And I was one of the few that did not get seasick. So I'm going to add that to my resume. But
and so just to make things clear, you did not see John, like he wasn't around. I mean, because Jesus was kind of ambiguous as to whether or not he was gonna right. So
I did not see John. I saw a couple of people that were really old with impressive beards, but
some people are listening. They're like, "What in the world is he talking about?"
If he lives until I come, what's that to you?
Yeah.
Oh, Peter, bless his heart.
Okay, so dad, husband, professor, minister. What are you really excited about besides like having some time off? Like what is exciting to you right now?
Well, I'm in a lot of good discussions with people that I love about the Lord, and some of those people are very far from him and have never known him, and other people are dear friends. One of my passions over the last 5 years has been having discussions with a lot of non-institutional brothers and sisters. There's a backstory there. I had a public discussion and some writing back and forth. And what I found is, when you love people and you respect people and you want to talk about the Lord, doors open. I mean, not everybody's going to be receptive, but there's a lot of good things happening there. And I'm hopeful that, the Lord will continue to bless those opportunities. I'm working on a writing project on of all things, the treasury, not because I'm overly excited about exploring a topic that the New Testament says so little about, but that seems to be such a big drive for a lot of folks that I care about, that I'm just wanting to think about those things a little bit more intentionally. So that's near the top of the list, that and college football season not being far around the corner.
Okay, do I want to ask, tell me you're a Tennessee fan.
I am a Tennessee fan.
Well, I mean, not literally because I said that. Like, are you really?
I am.
Oh,
and
okay.
My sweet bride, Christy, is an Alabama fan. So we've,
House divided.
I would say it's a rivalry. It's been more of like a crime scene, with the exception of one year when we squeaked out a win by a field goal. So now that Saban's retired, there might be a glimmer of hope. But, we'll see.
So your wife has got to gloat quite a bit in your house.
She's a very patient and sweet person, and so is her mother. But I remember one year, her mother, who's turning 90 this year, called me right after the game was over and was like, "Hey, were you watching the game?" And just because they're all Alabama fans. And, it's been a good reminder to me that God wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So,
okay, well, let's get serious here. I talk about, we mentioned as I was kind of showing you around the building and stuff, we talked a little bit about the current culture right now. And I'm not really like a doom and gloom kind of person, but it's hard not to recognize or to see a cultural shift, let's say in the last 20 years or so. Like a lot of things that I think most people, even non-religious people, would have considered to be like pretty basic moral foundational principles, are all they're up for grabs now. I mean, it's this whole culture of your truth is your truth and subjective morality, and so I'm interested to see from your perspective as a college professor. Granted, it's a Christian university, but I don't think Christians are immune to this changing paradigm. Just kind of what's your takeaway? What's your views on where we're at right now as a society, as a culture?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think anyone who wants to share the gospel and live for Jesus has to think about that, pray about that. And so I'm a bit conflicted because on the one hand, I hear people say, and I don't believe you would say this, but I've heard it said, even from a pulpit or two, things are worse now than they've ever been. 2020 especially. This is, COVID. This has to be some kind of warning sign. And Russia and the Ukraine and Israel and Haiti and Trump, Biden, and all this stuff. And I just kind of want to step back from that and say things have been pretty bad since Genesis 3. I'm not a pessimist either. I have a lot of hope in the Lord. I'm not surprised by that. I think Jesus helps us to anticipate not that things are just going to gradually get worse, but they're not going to get better. And yet, what an opportunity we have to share something good. But on the other hand, I think smartphones, I think And it may just be that we're not as good at hiding it anymore, because I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that nostalgia is a liar.
Yeah.
And so anybody that looks to the 50s and, the GI Bill and prosperity in a post-World War II culture when congregations were building big buildings and bus ministries and children's homes, but without accusing anyone of anything, a lot of segregation, a lot of injustice, a lot of not necessarily looking to share the gospel with everybody. And again, I know that there are exceptions to that, and so I don't know. I have a lot of hope in the students I serve because they're a lot more transparent than we were 30 years ago, and they've seen and experienced some things already in their young lives that I've never had to think about or experience. And so I'm torn because we're in a different battle now. There's a war going on, Ephesians 6, but on the other hand, Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I have hope.
Yeah. A couple interesting points there that, you mentioned this current generation. There's a more of an openness and authenticity maybe to their dialogue, their interactions, their relational dynamics with other people. Yet at the same time, the innocence of a youth has been stolen.
It's gone.
Mostly because of technology advancements. So how do those two things contrast? How is that something that we deal with as leaders of the church, right? In that regard, how do we navigate those two things where we have this whole generation that is positioned between those two contrasting points?
Yeah, I'll just illustrate this by the way it's changed my thinking about teaching. I don't view my role as an instructor or preacher anymore as the sage on the stage. Not that I was ever the sage, but I think this idea of someone getting up who's the expert and letting us all in on what he or she has figured out is probably gone in a AI, Siri, Alexa, whoever else we want to call upon for help setting. You can instantly be fact-checked. And so being honest is a good thing. And I think in addition to that, being genuine, being a person of integrity, being a person who remembers that kindness and gentleness and patience are fruit of the Spirit, not just self-control. And so I think there's an opportunity here to, rather than trying to fight all of that, we use the opportunities the Lord gives us through some of these mediums to reach people and to try to speak the truth into darkness. We have to be humble. Anybody who's going to demand to be referred to as doctor, or to have some kind of artificial level of separation, I just don't think that's not incarnational ministry in our setting. And so, I even think about this when I'm standing up at Estes. We have about 300 members or so when school's not in, and there are several congregations represented in that room.
Right.
And I'm trying to think about who they are and where they are, and not that the message necessarily changes, but my sensitivity to what people are walking through and what people are struggling with. And, what I've seen in my students is if they're struggling with pornography, they're going to talk about that. They're not going to sweep it under the rug. They're not ashamed, and I think with same-sex attraction, the same thing, and those are hard to talk about in a generational context. But the sooner we wake up to the opportunities to serve and to speak the truth, the better.
So I have a limited purview of different. I do now more than when I was a campus minister because I was exposed to a lot of representative churches across the Southeast with the students coming in, obviously. But my generation, I think we're probably same generation. There was a hesitancy. There's some things you just didn't talk about, and certainly the generation above us. And so your generation, our generation, maybe the generation before us, are not as apt to deal with these sensitive topics like sexual orientation and pornography and that kind of stuff. So I say all that to say that my purview as a campus minister was that the church leadership that I was being told about from the students, those were off-topic conversations. The church's church leadership is not dealing with that from a big macro perspective. What I have continued to see so far is that still seems to be the case. I could be wrong. You probably have a larger purview of churches across, at least the Southeast, maybe even broader than that. Our church leadership, are we tackling those topics like we need to be tackling them, or do we just need to kind of keep a hands-off approach still on it?
Definitely not a hands-off approach, but I think how we approach that is a big question. And I'm not saying this is something I've done well or the congregation I serve, but we have a thriving men's ministry where we can talk about this stuff in a way that I don't think anybody could necessarily talk about it from the pulpit. Mm-hmm. Because you're dealing with, I do think you've got to address these kinds of things. When I think about distinctiveness of Christianity, I think a generation or two ago, that list would have just included baptism's essential, Lord's Supper every first day of the week. But I think we've got to recognize that it's not just what you believe and how you worship. It's your ethic. It's your treatment of other people. And so we've had men openly talk about their struggles in these areas. And there are ladies' ministries that do the same thing. But I've found traditionally ladies' ministries are generally more effective, and they're almost omnipresent from congregation to congregation because our sisters generally do a better job of opening up than us dudes do sometimes. And so how you go about doing that, but if you're of a mindset that thinks that there's no place to deal with this in the church, hey, they're going to go find help somewhere.
Yeah.
And I just would rather that come from a place where the Bible is central to that dialogue and wise men and women are involved in that discussion, because they're going to go and look for answers. Right. And I don't know that I feel good about generally what they might find if the world's offering an answer to that.
Yeah, along these same lines too, Doug, as I've worked with college students over the last 12 years and seen like the ubiquitous nature of really an onslaught of pornography and just the level that has ratcheted up. And I kept stats as I worked with these kids, young adults, and saw an increase that was almost it was almost doubling year after year. It was just getting and the female population
Absolutely.
Was actually growing as far as addictive behavior is concerned. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at how certain churches seem to be responding to the need to address that issue. And by the way, not just college students.
Oh,
we're church members.
Yeah.
If you believe some statistics, ministers,
right,
preachers, 60% are addicted to pornography. Yeah. So this is not just something that is isolated to our youth. It's something that has crept its way into churches, and now is just this thing that is another thing that we need to deal with, along with the doctrinal stuff and all of the other things that you mentioned. So saying all that to say, what do you think that church leadership specifically, should be doing right now to deal with sexuality in the current cultural climate that we're in?
Well, I think it's true, and the more you do premarital counseling and are trying to help people come out of these addictive patterns and find what God intends for the home, the more you'll find that whether or not this is what's said, it's certainly what a lot of young people hear, and even other Christians. Sex is bad. Don't go there. Don't think about going there. Avoid that. Mm-hmm. That's the wrong message. And I think it creates a culture where there's either so much shame associated with that when young people or older people get married, they struggle in that area of their relationship, or they assume that, it's possible just to sin so much and to be so far gone that God can't possibly forgive me. And so I think this has to be God-centered. It has to highlight God's willingness to forgive anyone who is willing to come to him. It's going to require transparency. I've wondered sometimes how, I don't know the number, but could a 30-minute conversation with somebody where you're just completely transparent and where you gain some accountability change the course of a person's life? I mean, how many people are at risk of not experiencing the joys of Christian fellowship because they're too busy avoiding being discovered,
right?
Wanting to keep that hidden. And so I think we've got to be intentional. This is not going to happen by accident. We've got to, like you mentioned, look to assist men and women in this area. We've also got to deal with a lot of cases where young women are being mistreated. I'm talking about women that come out of Christian homes. The vast majority of them have had some kind of sexual experience, and most of the time it's extremely negative. And these are kids that are coming out of homes where they've been loved and protected and where mom and dad have been trying their best to help them. So we've just got to wake up. We've got to be intentional. We've got to be careful not to give this message that, I remember a guy doing a lesson where he had this big wedding dress and he sprayed ketchup and mustard and chocolate syrup all over it. And the idea was, sin stains. And yeah, I want to talk about the seriousness of sin, but I'm pretty sure God has the power to make all of that go away.
Yeah.
And that's the other, you got to warn against the evil and the struggle, but you've got to talk about hope and people, we just got to be very careful. What about the person that's already fallen short? Because I think that's the majority of people.
Right.
And in a social media world where we're pretending like, man, my family's great.
Yeah.
I've got it all together. I don't have any problems. But if you do, I'm a we preacher, not a you preacher. Like I'm going to be a part of that struggle.
Yeah.
We've got to be real.
Yeah. You mentioned, something that just kept occurring over and over to me with especially the female population in college was the shame issue of their past and not being able to put that aside. And, one of the conversations that I had a lot of times is, what do you think Jesus went to the cross for, and who do you think he went to the cross for? And because if you don't feel like you're good enough, then Jesus wasn't good enough. It wasn't powerful enough to make you like literally this beautiful creature that can stand before God, wholesome, clean, holy, and that's what he did. That's the work of the cross. And I think that's a message that maybe we're not putting out there as much as we should, at least amongst the college students.
Yeah, that's what he wants. If I may, I struggle with that for a long time, especially thinking about Matthew 5-7 and Jesus' the Sermon on the Mount, and there's this camera fixed on Jesus, right, as he's sitting there, and he's perfect, and everything he says is spot on, and how could I ever be like the Lamb of God? Mm-hmm. But then what if that camera sort of turned and went across that crowd? And I think you would find that you're dealing with people who have real problems. Some of them have health problems, relationship problems, addictions, trials, and they're just like us. And if that's who he was talking to, well, then why can't I see myself as part of that crowd that's being offered something real?
Yeah. And I think we have a tendency to say, well, those are all issues that need to be dealt with privately in the home. And I'm thinking, man, this is what the church was built for. Like we should be relational. It's one of the things that I've been talking about to our congregation here is that if we have a mentality that we've done our Christian part by showing up on Sunday morning and we've had some pleasantries with our fellow brothers and sisters, and then we don't see or talk or think about them until the next Sunday, that doesn't seem like a picture to me of what it's supposed to be like. And I think a lot of this stuff that you and I are talking about so far gets dealt with in a really healthy manner if we go back to more of the Acts 2 type of living with one another in that relational dynamic.
Yeah, I can't assume that these students or anyone has the same support network I've been blessed to have. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of them don't. They don't feel like there's many people they could talk to about a lot of these things. And you're right. If it's that Southern, no disrespect, I've grown up in the South and was even in Louisiana for 6 years. Talk about South. But, that, how are you? Fine.
Yeah.
And, don't say anything other than fine. You've broken the code, and you can just look at my face and know that I didn't really ask you that because I want to know. Like, I think people can smell the difference, and especially young people.
What's and I know these are all questions now coming off the top of my head. What's an effective way, or is there an effective way for churches that may be listening to this, or church leaders to have a deeper relational connection with their church members? I mean, because obviously if you have a 300-member church, you're not going to get to know people on that kind of level.
Right.
Like what are some ways, or a way that we might be responding to that need?
Well, I think if you're talking about leaders connecting, I think it would be wonderful if every elder spends time, with the shepherding group. I'm not talking about anything formal, but a group of people every Sunday he's responsible for noticing and for calling during the week, and maybe inviting with maybe another person or two into their home. There's just nothing that will ever replace sitting around a table together, even if it's just for coffee. I mean, I love that stuff. Probably too much.
You just said something that I know. Anybody that knows me was like, oh, he told him to say that. No, listen, I did not tell Doug to say what he just said. But I couldn't agree more with that. We're missing the home aspect of our spirituality.
Well, and we send our guys, they all teach the teen class every now and then. They're in the college classes. We've got adopted student programs, nothing, all that formal. We're trying to have a lot of activities, including, the assembly. When you worship together, that's wonderful, but It's a part of the greater picture, and, know their name.
Yeah.
I love the fact that when we have people respond publicly, like the elders know their names. They've already, when somebody needs a visit, I go, and 2 or 3 of them have already been there a couple of times. And so it's relational.
Sure.
And you just can't put like a visitation program on that Band-Aid and it be okay.
Right.
You can't fake that. You can't know their birthday, know anniversaries, know what they're wrestling with and struggling with. I have a friend, Brad Montague, who's sort of famous for Kid President and some other things he's done through the years, but his mantra is be the person you needed when you were younger.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
And there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Right. Yeah. Maybe related to all this, maybe a completely different topic, but what do you feel like is the biggest challenge to churches, the church, in the next 10 years?
Well, I think you could look at that from a number of perspectives. One would be the social political reality of a culture that is moving more and more post-Christian, where we're going to be, we sort of already view this as a question of, with the LGBTQ plus agenda and with the role of women question and with just a lot of societal pressures. I think the church has always sort of been out of sorts with the world in some ways, but it's not just what we believe, it's how we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got to speak with compassion. I think we've got to make it clear that God, He loves all people and He desires what's best for all people, and we better show that by the way we treat people too. But I also think that we're seeing a polarization even within the kingdom.
Yeah.
And I want to be mindful of Matthew 16:19 and how there's a tendency at times to bind what ought not be bound, loose what ought. And I'm just as much of the problem as anybody in that, hey, we can have great friendship and fellowship as long as you agree with me, and that's a dangerous way to live. And I just see with the influence of influencers on social media and schools going their own way, whichever direction they're going, and just I think that there's this false dichotomy between being rooted in the Word of God or being relevant to the world. And, we need to strive to be people of the book who love our neighbor. And so that form of ministry, it's just, you can't live in either of those ditches. Yeah. And I think keeping that in the middle of the road has already proven difficult for a lot of congregations because we're sometimes motivated by fear or what other people might think more than we are what's right. And I'm not running for any office. I don't want to intentionally offend anybody, but, you can't do a whole lot without offending somebody.
Yeah.
And so you just, you try to love them, you try to wash feet, you try to be like Jesus. So there's pressure from without and pressure from within. And I think being a person of integrity who tries to be consistent, but I want to be as transparent as I can be. And Estes, they probably get sick of me talking about how much I need God's help and how much I need forgiveness and I need them. But I react really negatively against folks that get up and they don't have a weakness. They're just better than everybody else. Yep. And you're there just to bask in their glory. I just don't think that's very effective.
That's so powerful. I know, especially in a culture that is so, a postmodernistic society that we're clearly in. If I could tell you, some of the stuff that our Christian students are hearing from the secular university level, listening to these professors basically indoctrinate them into a system that they're teaching them that to have religious viewpoints, broad, is actually evil, because it goes against your own personal liberties and freedoms and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, and now we're saying, they come back to us and you're like, well, how do you navigate that conversation? And what I have found is that when I tried to pontificate, when I tried to be that, that scriptural leader that I thought needed to be, drawing the line in the sand, so to speak, it just disenfranchised them even further. But when I started, just being like truly without barriers, transparent, saying, you know what, I don't have all the answers, and let me tell you, I sin on a daily basis. And why don't we sit down and talk about this, and you get to know me better, and I get to know you better, and we have some meals together, and we form a relationship together. That was always way more effective in then having a conversation about doctrinal stuff, because then at least they knew I was approaching them out of a spirit of love and care and concern rather than just trying to dictate, some old-fashioned way of doing things.
Yeah, and they know, they see what's genuine, and they know that the academic elites and the apologists exaggerate, because I'm really wanting you to see things my way.
Right.
And I just really don't want to, I love teaching Greek. That makes me a weirdo. But, people just really abuse that. They abuse Greek. And there's a part of me that just wants to stand up sometimes and say, you're making more of that than you should.
Yeah.
But the reason I enjoy doing it is because it allows me to sort of keep myself in check. And, I don't think you have to have that ability to please the Lord or understand his will. But that's an example of how, people either avoid it like the plague because they think it's scary, or they overuse it because they think they're doing it accurately, or they don't know how to do it accurately. And so my point in that is, if I exaggerate because I'm trying to manipulate the Greek to win an argument, well, then what else might I be exaggerating about? So if you can't trust what I'm saying about this word, well, then why would you trust what I'm saying about Jesus?
Yeah.
And those academic elites are actually reacting to some things that people have done in the name of Christ or religion through the years that have been atrocious.
Yeah.
And so can I say, well, here's probably where they're coming from, and not that I'm trying to agree with them, but there's some truth in this, and then here's the agenda, and let's just talk about how you end up here rather than there.
Right. I don't know who coined the phrase, but the first time I ever read it, kind of talking about this type of thing, was C.S. Lewis when he said intellectual snobbery. Speaking of that, and now I'm just completely going in a different direction, because you're saying stuff that I'm like, I wanted to ask about that. Okay, so I'm not a Greek scholar. Don't pretend to be. Don't know Greek. Don't know Hebrew. I know a few words, but couple questions. First off is a very personal question. People watching this are going to laugh. So how do you say, what is the correct pronunciation for fellowship in the Greek? So I've heard koinonia, kinonia. I'm like, okay, it doesn't matter, I know, but is there a correct pronunciation for that word that is generally accepted amongst those who actually know Greek?
All right, I'm going to go full nerd for about a minute
Okay.
here. I'm so excited about this. This and coffee and Jesus, not in that order. But so we use the Erasmian pronunciation system, which was actually developed in the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
Try to be consistent. With koinonia, that's the way I would say it. There's a couple of things I would note. First of all, there are two O vowels. There's the omicron and the omega. Omicron's the short O, omega's the long O.
Okay.
But not everybody follows that consistently. Like the word logos. If you use that software package in accordance or with Logos software,
Which is Word, right?
Word,
Okay.
That's right. I called one time and it was the guy trying to help me pronounced it logos. Well, it's the same vowel.
Yeah.
But so I think that's part of the challenge with koinonia, as someone might say it. They've made the omicron sound like an omega.
Mm-hmm.
But really the key, and again, people can take a nap during this part if they want, but is where's the accent? Because putting the accent on the right syllable, makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And that's traditionally you put the emphasis on the syllable that has the accent. Koinonia has a pair of vowels at the beginning of that. It's kappa, omicron, iota, and that's a diphthong, and it has the circumflex accent over the iota. So koinonia or koinonia with a short O, the omicron. So there's some rules that govern that. But again, if I'm listening to somebody and they say koinonia, I'm not going to think less of them. I mean, I hope people are showing me grace as I'm trying to show them grace.
So it's all with the emphasis.
Emphasis on the right syllable.
On the right syllable. Okay. So just for clarification, how do you say it?
Koinonia.
Koinonia.
Yes, and it's a great, there's some great tools and some great, you can get an audio Bible, a Greek audio Bible, and I learned a lot of pronunciation just simply by listening, in addition to just going to school forever.
So along those lines, for the typical person like myself, just loves the Word of God, loves to read it, loves to study it, but doesn't have the time nor the inclination to get into the Greek or the Hebrew. How important is it to know the language because I know that so the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us.
Right.
But I know that in my limited study of the original languages, there's things that I learned that I didn't know before. So how important is it for a Christian who has a passion for Jesus, wants to do what Jesus taught, that we know the original language, or at least study it? Is that something that we should be doing?
Well, I think there's a lot of room between C.S. Lewis, intellectual snobbery, and anti-intellectualism. Mm-hmm. And both of those extremes are alive and well. Don't go get an education. You might lose your faith.
Yeah.
What does that say about your faith if you're afraid to learn?
Right.
On the other hand, assuming that you have to have a PhD to know God's will is a really dangerous position to take. And so to offer a bad analogy, how important is it that I know how my Chevy Impala operates under the hood? Well, I'm fortunate in that I can take it to somebody who knows all about that. Mm-hmm. They can plug it in, they can solve the problem. But every now and then, I'm broken down on the side of the road, and it might be a little while before USAA sends the people to help rescue me. Right. I know we're not talking about the mechanics of how a car runs, but I think a lot of this depends on a couple of questions. One, are you claiming to help other people understand how the car runs? Mm-hmm. And if you are, I don't think you have to have a thorough knowledge of diphthongs and, diacritical marks. But I think, for example, BibleGateway.com, I'm not making any money off of that, but it allows you to read, 50 English translations comparatively. And generally, if there's a Greek question, I don't get up and talk about Greek hardly ever. It's behind the curtain of my preparation. But if I have something I want to bring out, I typically will use other English translations where people listening know they can go and find that. They don't have to have Doug show up and give them the answer. Yeah. And so I think it's important, but I think reading English translations comparatively and paying attention to footnotes. I love the Net Bible because it has about 64,000 footnotes, and a lot of those footnotes are about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it would break my Greek teacher heart to say, nah, it doesn't matter. It is important, but I think the other thing I've already alluded to is that everybody tries to use Greek to advance their argument. And part of the reason they can do that is because there's a lot of ambiguity with some of these questions. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm thinking about how often in Romans it's a question of whether it's subjective genitive or objective genitive. Well, it could be either. A lot of that's going to depend on the perspective of the translator.
Right.
And so being able to know that as a translator, you're a gatekeeper, you're trying to be forthright with the evidence. You're also trying to be honest when there's more than one option. There's also textual variations that we get excited about sometimes. And so I think my primary goal in life is to help people learn about Jesus and fall in love with him. And Greek's one of the ways I can do that. But it's like, one more bad analogy. Around Easter every year, somebody comes up with a lost book of the Bible. Gospel of Thomas, right. Gospel of Philip. How much time should we spend reading apocryphal books and pseudepigraphal books? Well, if that takes people's attention off of Bible study, well, then I'm not going to send a lot of people there. But if it's something you have a question about, by all means, go read it and compare it. Yeah. So that's a rather convoluted answer, but I think it does matter, but it's not going to give you secret knowledge. It's not going to give you all the answers. It might raise more questions, but it's a useful tool. Hebrew is too.
What would the Bereans do?
Well, they were probably enjoying their Septuagints, so I think the Bereans, obviously Acts 17 would have used every resource they had to have been as thorough as possible. And we've got a lot of great tools. I'm not paranoid, but I would just not assume that everything I see online is necessarily true. Even what AI generates is taking some great things, it's compiling. But there's a lot of fake news with regard to Greek and the background of this stuff. So I would just, again, don't rely on the experts. We all are imperfect and have agendas too. But I think reading comparatively, and so if you're a die-in-the-wool King James only person, you're going to have to probably get over that and look at what some other translations say. And if you struggle with that, go back and read the preface of the King James and see what they were claiming to want to do, and it's not what you would assume about that. Yeah,
I know that's a hot topic for some churches. King James only.
I talk a lot about that, and I've only had 2 occasions in my preaching life where my kids were afraid I might get beat up, and one of them was in a situation I was invited into because the church had split. There was a preacher there who was KJV only, and he had been fired, and they asked me to come talk about the history of the English Bible before the King James. And I was careful and loving, but there's some strong feelings about that.
Yeah, I may be wrong in saying this, and just kind of wrapping up this piece of the conversation is, I don't think that we realize as Christians just how much is available to us. How many resources and really what a fantastic job. Really, I mean, in the major translations that we use, that the translators did, that is, I mean, it is giving us pretty much the essence of what the original language intended. That's a naive statement, right? I mean, I don't know that for sure, but I'm saying it just based on what I know.
I think you're right. And the way to test that, we make it sound so simple, like translations are people. And well, this is just the way the NIV is. But if you read verse to verse comparatively, and I'm not saying that's the way Bible study has to always look, but if you have a question about a verse, what you'll find is that the standard major translations almost always read nearly identically the same. Right. And what if there's one that's kind of weird?
Yeah.
Generally, that means that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Now, there might be an exception where someone did something weird, but it actually makes sense. But that's why I'm thinking reading comparatively helps us. And the other dynamic here, and I know this isn't what we're here to talk about primarily, but the NIV, for example, Doug Moo and the translators, the Global Translation Committee, they knew all the criticisms that they were getting, especially after the TNIV, today's NIV. And so in 2011, Zondervan, they put out a revised NIV, and tried to take all the other ones off the market. That's arguably better than the ESV, which is the RSV 2.0, and several other translations that we sort of look at as safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so if for those who had concerns about the NIV in 77 or in 2001 when the ESV first came out, I would go back and look again. I'm not trying to be an apologist for it, but I'm just saying that a lot of the critiques and old things you might find online may no longer be true after 2011. These translations are adjusting and changing, and that's true of the King James.
Yeah.
1679 recension is what most people are foundationally using if they're King James. And then there are a lot of other changes that you might want to look at before you make the case that your translation is inerrant.
That's interesting. Am I allowed to ask what your favorite translation is?
Of course. I'm using this poor translation. It's been beat up. It's got duct tape. I was given this back in 2004 when I began preaching at the Goodwood Boulevard Church in Baton Rouge, because they had New American Standard 95 update in the pew. And now, so in 2020, the Lockman Foundation put out the NAS 2020 and the Legacy Standard version. And they did that so that they could market it to a conservative readership that loves the New American Standard, except they called it the Legacy Standard, and then a more gender-inclusive translation, New American Standard 2020. So I'm sitting here thinking, none of my students use this, not a one. And I don't know of anybody at Estes using this translation. So I'm probably needing to go with something that people are using. But this got my notes in it, and I've memorized out of this. So Legacy Standard sounds like I should wear like a vest and a bow tie, Yeah. New American Standard 2020, I need to get like a T-shirt and some cool sunglasses. I kind of feel somewhere in the middle on that. So
if we could transfer all your notes and you lost that and you had to go buy a new one today.
Probably the ESV. I don't dislike the ESV. I just dislike the way it was marketed initially. Mm-hmm. I mean, for a translation that's been out 23 years to be as dominant as it is, and for it to be a repackaged, revised standard version with as controversial as that was. I mean, Wayne Grudem's a nice guy, but probably that just simply because people are using it. A lot of people are using it, and I'm not trying to be a stick in the mud.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah.
Stick in the mud, sometimes that trips you up when you need to be tripped, right?
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
All right, so thinking of revival from a global perspective, are we at the point where the church needs a true revival, large picture, macro perspective?
I think so. I think most of our congregations are comfortable. I think we've settled with some realities that aren't healthy. And again, painting with a broad brush.
Right.
But I think it's easy to be more interested in redecorating the house than inviting people into the house. It's easy to, and I think there are some ways, if you're thinking, well, this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, I would just encourage you to look at the budget, because, your mission is where your money is. And look at what you spend most of your time praying about and talking about. And so that's not true of every congregation, but I think the vast majority of our congregations and individual Christians need to be reminded of our higher citizenship in an election year. We could go down that road.
Yeah.
I had a post a few weeks ago that kind of went viral. I mean, it was shared like 100 times, so it's not like big deal. But what would Paul post on social media? And, I just wanted to say, I don't think he would ever use that to hurt people. I don't think he would ever use that to call a political leader Christ or Satan.
Yeah. I
don't think he would. I think he would look for ways to speak the truth in love. I think he would look for ways to be prayerful and attentive. And since that's sort of the front porch of a lot of Christians' lives now, and our web presence is sort of the front door, just look around. Are we still using a homepage from 1993 that has incorrect information? And are we that's where I think a lot of people go first.
Is there a right way to get that ball rolling and a wrong way to get that ball rolling?
There's definitely a wrong way in that I can't hitch my wagon to a generational idea. I can't say, well, we're just going to care about the young people. You know, a great place to think about this is worship music. You want to start a fight. You know, should we sing Stamps Baxter? Should we sing Martin Luther, or should we sing Hillsong? I have challenges with all three of those.
Yeah.
You know, so let's put down the weapons and sing what honors God.
Yeah.
And so I think the wrong way would be to force feed, to hold on to power, to be manipulative or dishonest. I think you could sacrifice. It's that Ephesians 4:1-6. It's not just the 7 ones of 4-6. It's the way that you go about communicating that with gentleness, patience, and tolerance in 1-3. And so I think you could just forget about people and run over them. Although sometimes you got to deal with the atrophies. You've got to shake the dust off your feet. You got to move on. I think the right way would be anything that honors God's will and that thinks more about others than ourselves.
Are we in a period of time where you think that a true reawakening of the church, or a true revival that is reaching out, not to be divisive and not to hammer people over the head with Scripture, but to reach them in love and compassion and integrity and honesty and, you know, openness, all of the stuff that we see Jesus doing when he was here? Is the world at this point in time, do you think they're receptive to that, or are we in a time period that maybe is going down some darker pathways?
I don't really see. I think that's a great question, but it's pretty complicated just because when we say we, are we talking about the full spectrum of churches of Christ? Because I think you're going to have some people on one end of the spectrum who have made the form of what we do and who we are sacred. And so if you're not coat and tie, if you're not buttoned up and cleaned up and speak with the language that Guy and Wood spoke in, well, then we don't want you.
Right.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's so ecumenical that there's nothing distinctive at all. So I think both ends of that spectrum are going to struggle some. Of course, we're perfectly in the middle. Yeah. Just kidding. But then I think the other piece of that is it depends on what parts of the world we're talking about taking the gospel to. I think, ironically, in my limited ministry experiences, disaster opens the door for ministry. Like 2 hurricanes on the Gulf Coast taught us a lot about no longer being segregated and no longer being isolated, because we were forced to love our neighbor and think about others. And so, I'm greatly concerned for the Muslim world. I'm greatly concerned for other populations of people who don't know much about us because we've given the appearance of just kind of being over in the corner to ourselves and quiet. And it's an Americanized Christianity. It's a sterile, we'll welcome you as long as you learn how to talk like we talk and think like we think.
I mean, even within the churches of Christ, like I can't even say that as a pluralistic, holistic, the churches of Christ, because we're so set up autonomously anyway. Yeah. So we're already kind of out there on our own as congregations. I look at some of the other I say other denominations. I'm not saying that Church of Christ is a denomination, but they have a much more, I would say, global presence in responding to the needs of the crisis of the world in ways that maybe we struggle with, because just within our own community we have some divisive stuff going on. So,
but that's ironic. I'm sorry to
no, yeah, go ahead.
Like we're autonomous officially, but unofficially we're in camps.
Yeah.
And like my Southern Baptist friends, I went to New Orleans Seminary, got a lot of friends I love and appreciate, will tell you, yeah, we've got a convention, but we're really divided, and sometimes you hear about it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not comparing us, apples to apples, but when I would sit down around coffee tables with those guys, we would often discover that our problems in ministry were very much the same.
Right.
let's say involve people and trying to serve people. So I don't know. I think the only thing that there's just a lot of history, and I think the way that I think this is a 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14. In matters of conviction and conscience, okay, you've got a sister who really feels more comfortable wearing a head covering. You've got a brother who really doesn't want to support non-Christians out of the church treasury. I mean, those are sticky things that are difficult, but being able to separate those matters of personal conscience from things like loving our enemies and serving the poor and helping people see Jesus really is the only door. I mean, I just don't want to spend my time like rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
Yeah.
I want to be about the Father's business, even when you may get criticized for it.
Yeah. And I guess that's my question is does the church at large, okay, do we recognize that perspective, or are we still very caught up in our divisive types of conversations?
I think it just depends on who you talk to. I mean, I think there's benefits in traveling and having conversations with people that differ from you and really listening, and not trying to be thinking as they're talking about what I'm going to say next. Yeah. And we love the church. We love God's people. We want growth and success, but you've got to be a little less stubborn. You've got to be a little less judgmental.
You have an opportunity to speak to every single member of the Church of Christ, hypothetical, and you have about a minute to give them a message, to say something to them, and they're all going to hear it at the same time. What are you telling everybody?
I would say with kindness, stop living in the past and open your eyes to a world of people that could care less about the things that have divided us. They could care less about, what happened in the 50s. They need to know the Lord, and not because of anything we've done, but I think we do have a distinctive message to share that is God-honoring with regard to simple worship and simple response. And let's make sure that my minute's almost up, but let's make sure that we are very careful with the 5-finger exercise. And what I mean by that is, while you're talking to people about what they must do to be saved, and I've heard the sermons and preached them and believed them, let's talk about what God's done to offer you the opportunity for salvation. I think the reason John Piper and even John MacArthur, those are very different guys, the reason a lot of people are flocking to their YouTube stuff is because they've assumed we don't talk about grace, because hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, being baptized, what about God taking the initiative to offer us salvation? So there's a lot. I need another minute. But I would just want to highlight trusting in God, preaching simple truth, and stop living in the past.
Yeah. All of that makes me think about, talking about people I've talked to, baby boomers, the greatest generation. And I often hear, from my parents, and this isn't a dig at them, mom and dad, if you're listening, this isn't a dig against you, but they're, they talked about that age of innocence and things were great back in the 50s. And if we could only go back to that point in time. And I was talking to another of my friends who's an African-American, and I was talking about that very thing. And he was like, yeah, it was a great time for who? For white people.
That's right.
So we don't have that self-awareness that maybe is necessary. And we're so inculcated to our own belief systems and, how we've been raised that we can't seem to look past that in meaningful ways.
And I wonder, no disrespect to Tom Brokaw and the Greatest Generation stuff, but I wonder if the Lord allows the world to stand long enough, 50 years from now, while people will be looking back at our time and saying, well, they, those were good times, but look at all they missed.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what that will be, but I think that drives us to be humble and to be responsive and to be self-reflective.
Yeah. Willing to be wrong.
Yeah, I come by that naturally sometimes.
Our wives teach us that pretty fervently.
They're students.
All right, so we're out of time, but I want to thank you for sitting down and having this conversation. I've enjoyed it. I really have. We could have gone on for at least another hour. So I'd like to close out with a couple things, and I'm going to ask you to read a verse, whichever you want. It may be your Isaiah verse, and then we'll close things out. But I would like to just say to those that are listening, if you like what you hear, as always, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, share, and give us some feedback. I always like to hear feedback, good or bad. If you've got a guest in mind that you think would benefit our audience from hearing from, absolutely send me their name. I will reach out to them, or Parker, our producer, will reach out to them, and we'll get them here for you. Okay, so Doug, go ahead and read a passage of Scripture.
Well, of all the passages I thought we might think about, I'm going to limit this to one verse, even though it's in the midst of a great parable. And the message here is, there's a father worth coming home to. Luke 15:20. So he, the prodigal, got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. I'm thankful there's a father we can come home to.
Absolutely. Until our next podcast of The Line, the Way, and the War, love one another, be kind to one another, and remember, the creator of the universe loves you so much that he gave you his only son. Have a blessed day, everybody.